a little bit about me first. As I said, I'm at Birkbeck, the University of London, and in part of the Centre for Brain and Cognitive Development. And I'm also part of the Centre for Educational Neuroscience, which is a centre combining Birkbeck and UCL and the Institute of Education. And the center is interested in learning from or the cognitive neuroscience research and psychology research to try to see whether that can be useful in the educational context. I'm also the director of the Development and Cognitive Neuroscience Lab, and most of my research is focusing, this is a word cloud from my abstracts of my papers. You can see a lot of it is about adolescence. So I'm interested in development of children and adolescents. I look at both behavioral, so performance data, but also brain and activity in the brain and brain structure during this period of life. I compare adolescents to adults to have an idea of development, and the type of tasks or aspects of cognition I'm interested in are to do with social cognition as well as cognitive control. And these are topics that I'll come back to later. So to start with, a quote from a recent book, which is talking about the adolescence paradox. So the paradox is that in adolescence and young adulthood, the cognitive skills assumed to underlie educational and economic success are at a lifetime peak, yet educational achievement is lower for high school students than for elementary and middle schoolers. Moreover, the application of these mental faculties to real life seems woefully inadequate. Instead of learning from experience, reasoning about risks, and making sound decisions, youth often make unhealthy and unsafe choices. So today I'm going to talk about why our understanding of the adolescent brain may be helping us understand this paradox. So I will first introduce some ideas and recent research about brain development. And then I will focus on two aspects of cognition that have been studied particularly during adolescence. And one is cognitive control, and the other one is socio-emotional cognition. And finally, I'll kind of try and wrap up some of the points I've made that are relevant to education. So to start with brain development, what is adolescence and how do we define it? Well, the start of adolescence is defined biologically by puberty, which is a biological process driven by hormonal changes which lead to physical and reproductive maturity. The end, though, of adolescence is defined socially and culturally, and it's basically when individuals become independent and responsible members of society. And you can see that that's actually quite unclear definition in a way, and it really would depend on your culture and your country. This is a graph from a study looking at the pubertal stage of children followed longitudinally, so followed several time points, and the females are in pink, the males in blue, and you can see that one key finding or kind of evidence is that females go through puberty earlier than males. But there's also a lot of individual differences. So for example, here, this person here, this girl goes through puberty much later. So you see this increase in pubertal stage much later than this pink one here, which is already quite high in pubertal stage around age 10, 11. And the same for boys. So although we have a general pattern, there's a lot of individual differences in this sort of biological, physical changes associated with puberty. And there are also changes historically and socially. So historically, puberty tended, physical changes like the start of puberty tended to be later, so maybe 15 years, and the adult sort of responsible role started maybe around 18. While now puberty is starting earlier and earlier, for example, you might say age 10, 11, 12, and then young adults only reach an independent role as member of society, maybe in their mid-20s, because they've gone to university, they might continue to stay at home or be supported by their parents. So this phase of adolescence seems to have actually kind of become longer over time historically. So to talk about brain development and the kind of various things I'm going to talk about today, I think it's important to introduce some concepts and terminology about brain structure, which can be looked at really at two levels. So one level is the level of the cell. So the key cell in the brain are neurons. And this is a schematic representation of a neuron. So on one side, you've got a cell body and a long arm that's called an axon that allow neurons to connect with it to other neurons elsewhere in the brain and the body. And here, this junction is called a synapse. That's where neurotransmitters, like small chemical molecules, are released, and so that neurons can exchange information with each other. So here, this exchange of information is chemical, but along the axon, the information that is transmitted is along an electrical format. So it's the differences in electrical potential. And the axons are covered in a substance called myelin, which is a fatty substance. And this is by another type of cell called oligodendrocytes, and they wrap around the axon. And what that does is that the signal, the electrical signal that is conducting along the axon, can go faster and is more preserved because of this fatty coverage. And if you think about it, it's a bit like an electrical wire for in your connecting one of your electrical device. We have this plastic coverage on top, which is to make sure that the current flows through it better. So I will come back when I'm talking about brain development. I will go back and talk about these synapses, which are connecting to all these branches of the cell body, which are called dendrites. So the synapses and the myelin coverage of the axon are two things that are changing during development. So this is the cellular level, but then at the whole brain level, this is a slice through a kind of postmortem brain. And also I want to introduce some terminology. So this is slicing through this way, so from top to bottom. And the surface of the brain is all folded and it's called the cortex or gray matter. And it's folded so we can pack more into our skulls. And below the gray matter are white matter tracts, so white matter, which corresponds to the axons of the neurons. And it's white because it's fatty substance, this myelin that I was mentioning before. The gray matter, it includes the cell body and the dendrites and the connections that are arriving onto neurons. So we make this key distinction between gray matter and white matter in the brain. And there's also subcortical regions or nuclei that are down there, deeper down in the middle of the brain, which I will come back to later. So how is the brain organized? One key thing is that we kind of have a terminology of four lobes: the occipital lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and frontal lobe. So this is the front of the brain, this is the back of the brain. These are kind of major divisions of the brain. But a key thing is that the brain is organized so that certain brain regions are supporting certain aspects of cognition and do certain processing. So the occipital lobe is processing visual information, so it's important for vision. The temporal lobes is important for processing auditory information, is important for speech. The parietal lobe for sensation, and the back of the frontal lobe is involved in controlling your movements, so motor function, while the more interior parts are involved in supporting cognition, thinking, kind of other types of behavior. So this is kind of a simplistic view. Really, the brain is, we think in terms of networks. So it's a set of regions that are supporting particular aspects of cognitive function. And three networks that I will be talking about today relate to social cognition, cognitive control, and the processing of emotions and motivation. And I'm just kind of introducing them briefly here, but it's really to kind of talk about how the brain is organized. There's some brain regions that are specialized to process certain type of information, but they work together in networks to allow certain aspects of cognitive processes. So what happens during development? Well, this is measuring the brain volume for participants that are followed twice. So you see that this is the same participants that measured around eight, and then 15 years old. And if you measure the total brain volume, it actually doesn't change much after age 7, 8. So there's an increase in childhood, but then it stays pretty flat. But if you consider it separately, white matter and gray matter, what you see is that there's a significant increase in white matter volume, and that is thought to reflect myelination, and a decrease in gray matter volume, which is thought to reflect changes in number of synapses, the connections. So myelination, as I said, it's this coverage of the axon in layers and layers of this fatty substance called myelin. And the increase in white matter volume is thought to reflect the fact that at birth, only certain tracts are myelinated, and then gradually through development, more and more tracts go through myelination. And this is a process that doesn't happen at the same time all over the brain. And the key thing is that when tracts are myelinated, they might be a bit less flexible, adaptable, but the information goes faster. So these networks I'm talking about before, from maybe region in the front of the brain to the back of the brain, can work together and exchange information faster. The other aspects I was talking about gray matter reduction is at birth, children, so this is a drawing of the prefrontal cortex, so kind of region behind the forehead, and looking at drawing of neurons and their dendritic trees, so these branches that are around the cell body. And you can see at birth, actually, we pretty much have as many neurons as we will ever have. But there are very few connections. So you can see the branches increase very considerably in the first few months of life. So here from newborn to 6 months. And if you count the number of synapses, so the number of connections between neurons, they increase very much in between, so this is just pre-birth, in the first few months, a couple of years after birth, and then they decrease until they reach a plateau in adulthood. And so this increase and then decrease is thought to reflect kind of this increased number of synapses that give you a potential for neurons to work together. And then the neurons that are co-activated, that exchange information, they tend to kind of have more and more connections, while those neurons that don't seem to work together, they do not exchange information, then the connections between them are removed or called pruned away. So this is related to this decrease here. So the key thing is that means that children, depending on what they're doing, what they're learning, how they're interacting in their environment, there will be a selective kind of increase in certain synapses that are useful and then removal of synapses that are not useful. So the brain becomes attuned to whatever the child is learning and the behavior they're doing and then what they're experiencing. Another key aspect is that these changes are not happening at the same time all over the brain. So you can see here the green and red lines, which represent the visual cortex and the auditory cortex, so processing sort of sensory information, go through this decrease earlier than the prefrontal cortex, where these changes continue during adolescence. And so this means that the maturation and potentially ability to attune to environment and to learn and to the brain adapt to your environment continues later in the prefrontal cortex than in other brain regions. And maybe just as an aside, these are the kind of overall changes, but you constantly have changes in number of synapses locally, always creation and removal of synapses. And this is how your brain remembers things and stores information. So throughout our life, we have creation and removal of synapses, but during development, there's a very considerable increase early on and then a decrease of number of synapses. So this is just looking, again, at kind of on the neural level, but going back to, I was talking about the decrease in gray matter volume. The graph I showed earlier was the whole brain, but if you look at different parts of the brain, so this is plotting the surface of the brain, this is the front, the back, this is a view from the top, and the front here is here, and the back is here. What is plotted here is the thinning of the cortex, the thinning of the gray matter. And when the color gets more blue or purple, that means there's more cortical thinning. And you can see that this thinning doesn't happen at the same time all over the brain. Again, so these regions here, which are about sensory motor processing, so processing sensation and sending motor commands, become purple earlier as well than the parietal cortex. And the last regions to go through this are the frontal cortex and the temporal cortex here, which are regions involved in supporting cognitive control and social cognition, two things I will come back to during this talk and that are important during adolescence. So finally, I talked about the fact that the start of puberty was defined by hormonal changes. And there are very few studies that have looked at that. But the one question is, are the hormonal changes actually associated or leading to changes in the brain structure? And in this example of a study which focused on subcortical regions, so these regions located deep in the brain, they were trying to see whether the changes in the volume of these regions was related to chronological age of the participants over the course of adolescence, or whether changes were related to puberty stages, which reflect changes in hormone levels. And what they found was that for most of these regions, both age, which is the dotted line here, and puberty, which are puberty stages, which are illustrated by these rainbow-colored, mattered in terms of looking at structural changes in volume. At the top here, you've got males, at the bottom, females. You've got age here on the x-axis and the volume of these subcortical regions on the y-axis. And you can see for most of them, they are effects of puberty. Interestingly, they're not necessarily consistent between male and female. For some regions, they are. So for example, here, the nucleus accumbens shows quite a similar pattern for boys and girls. But the hippocampus seems to be much more sensitive to puberty stage in girls and not in boys, while the putamen on the reverse seems to be more sensitive to puberty stage in boys than in girls. So to conclude this section about brain development, adolescence is defined by a combination of biological and social cultural changes, and the development of brain structure is prolonged, and myelination allows greater speed of transmission of information across brain networks and synchronization of information coming from different sources. Synaptogenesis and synaptic pruning allow the tuning of neural networks to experiences and environments and the implementation of maturation and learning. And the last thing I was showing you was the hormones and age independently influence changes in brain structure. And finally, what I've tried to kind of show through different graphs is that there's considerable variability in brain development during adolescence between individuals, as well as in sort of puberty and the stages of puberty during adolescence. So in the second part, I'm going to talk about cognitive control. So cognitive control is the ability to flexibly adapt one's behavior in the pursuit of an internal goal by the coordination of cognitive processes. We also call cognitive control executive functions, and that is a bit like the executive in a company. So it's the person who's the CEO is making decisions and coordinating how different branches of the company are working. And there are a number of executive functions that have been looked at or that have been kind of theorized as being important. One is inhibitory control, which is the ability to stop an inappropriate prepotent response and ignore distractions. So, for example, that would be when you're talking to your friends, you might not use the same language as if you're talking to your boss. Working memory is the ability to temporarily monitor, maintain, and manipulate information in a mental workspace. So, for example, if you're keeping a number in mind or your password, typing it in and kind of changing it in your mind, this is all things you're keeping in working memory. Or if you're reading a sentence that can be quite long, maybe a sentence by Proust, then you need to remember the start of the sentence when you reach the end if you want to make sense of the whole sentence. So you have to kind of keep the whole all of this in your mind. Attention is the ability to sustain, divide, or selectively orient attention. And switching and flexibility is the ability to shift between mental states, rule sets, or tasks, and to have more flexible thinking. So these are maybe the kind of simpler executive functions. And together they support more complex executive functions like planning, managing your time, multitasking, prospective memory, which is remembering to do something later, problem solving, and aspects of self-monitoring and metacognition. So metacognition is not purely in executive functions, but is very related to it. And this is the idea of trying to monitor your own thoughts and behaviors and have this knowledge and this insight about your cognition. So it's thinking about your own cognition. And all of these aspects of executive functions and cognitive control continue to mature into adolescence. So just to give you a couple of examples, this is work I've done in Sweden with Torkel Klingberg. And in this study, participants were shown this 4x4 grid and shown a dot that was moving around in the screen. And then they had to retrace the pattern. So the dot was first shown here, 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 and here. If you count the kind of number of correct trials, you find that there is quite significant development of performance on this task between age 6 and 14, and then it kind of slows down a little bit in later adolescence, but there's still some improvement in performance. So how much you can keep in your mind continues to increase. And as kind of in a much larger study carried out by Larry Steinberg, a researcher in the States, has done a lot of work looking at adolescents. This is a cross-cultural study looking at more than 5,000 individuals between the age of 10 and 30 from China, Colombia, Cyprus, India, Italy, Jordan, Kenya, the Philippines, Sweden, Thailand, and USA. So it's really trying to have some representation of countries from around the world. And in this study, they tried to kind of use a few different measures of cognitive control, which they call self-regulation here, to see whether we had this consistent, what really is happening during the course of development during adolescence. So they use a Stroop task, which is a measure of inhibitory control. Mainly here, it's quite hard to say. You have to say the color of the font. So here you have to say yellow, despite the fact that the word blue is written here. So you have this conflict between the two, and you have to inhibit your automatic reading. A task of planning, which is represented here, and you have a starting configuration of dots, and then you have to move them on the rods to reach this in a sort of as few moves as possible to reach this final combination of positions. And then they also had some questions about self-reported planning in a questionnaire. And this is what they found, that there's very significant improvement in performance in this composite measure across these three tasks, where you only reach sort of plateau or adult sort of performance around age like mid-20s, early to mid-20s. So as I said, you have this prolonged development of cognitive control during adolescence. Interestingly, they were also able to look at whether there were differences between countries. And although overall there was quite consistent finding of improvement in performance over the course of adolescence, you can see here that the pattern for different countries was different. So some countries, there was steeper improvements during adolescence and then plateauing maybe earlier. Other countries showed kind of more prolonged linear changes over this time, and some others actually didn't show much age effects, for example, in India and Jordan. And so you kind of, although we have this consistent different pattern overall, there are changes between countries. So what happens in the brain during cognitive control development? And this is a very simplistic representation showing that the finding is that when participants are carrying out cognitive control tasks in a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner, so fMRI scanner, we ask them to complete this task, and we're trying to see where in the brain we see changes in activity. And what we find is that during the course of development between adolescence and adulthood, there's an increase in activity in the parietal cortex, in the intraparietal sulcus specifically. In the frontal cortex, we've observed increases, decreases, sometimes peaks during adolescence. There's a very kind of mixed bag of results. Overall, the interpretation is maybe there's an increased specialization of certain part of the prefrontal cortex for certain executive functions. So at younger ages, the prefrontal cortex would support pretty much everything and be involved in all executive functions, while gradually during the development, during childhood and adolescence, some regions would become more specifically activated for certain aspects of cognitive control. So we have this maybe specialization of frontal cortex regions to support specific executive functions. So what about the link between cognitive control and education? Well, cognitive control skills are crucial in most classroom settings. There are domain-specific associations. So for example, between working memory and mathematics. So I was talking to you, there's dot where you have to remember where the dots are on the screen. This is correlated with children and adolescents' mathematics performance. But also some other aspects of cognition, like of executive functions, which allow more abstract thinking, because you're kind of allowing you to disconnect a little bit from your environment and keep in mind more abstract thoughts. That might be important, for example, in philosophy, when you think about more abstract concepts. But more generally, attention and cognitive control are also important just in class or at home to allow you to sustain your attention towards listening to the teacher, sustain your attention on your coursework, not be distracted, and not kind of keep switching between tasks, or allowing you to kind of switch between tasks if you do need to. And so we also have this important element of the role of cognitive control for education. And it's also important in terms of monitoring your performance. So I was talking a little bit about this related to metacognition, but being aware of when you're making an error and correcting it, that is related to cognitive control, this kind of monitoring of performance. So from that, if there are associations between cognitive control and educational outcome, the question is, if there are also individual differences in cognitive control, can you train cognitive control so that children who have lower, for example, working memory, if that predicts poor mathematic outcome, could you try to improve working memory so that then they improve in maths? Well, that's been really the holy grail of research in the last couple of decades. And one approach has been to ask children to repeatedly practice some games on computers to try to improve their working memory. So, for example, CogMed has been a program that has been looked at quite a lot. And the idea here is that if working memory is predicting your ability to do arithmetic, reading, or following instructions, attending, then working memory is supported by a particular set of brain regions. And if you repeatedly practice working memory tasks, then you might improve the functioning of this working memory brain networks. And then the hope is that in turn, this improved network would allow you to perform better in arithmetic, reading, and following instructions, etc. While these studies show that executive functions improve when you ask children to complete tasks that are quite related, quite similar to the tasks they are performing on the computer, or tasks that are not on the computer, that are more verbal or on paper, but you kind of still working memory task, for example, you do find improvement. But unfortunately, there is very little transfer to other domains. There's maybe a little bit of evidence that general attention might improve a little bit, but you don't see that an improvement in maths, for example, that is of the same scale as the improvement in working memory you might observe on a task. And in fact, some studies show that those children who already have a better work memory to start with maybe are the ones that can improve more in working memory than the children with lower working memory that you were trying to target in the first place. Another approach is to focus more on strategy. So trying to think about encourage children to maybe use their executive functions appropriately in a certain context. So again, it goes through repeated practice, but really trying to implement this in a specific context. So while the previous studies, you're trying to train children, but not in the, for example, maths context. Here, the aim is to try to practice in a particular context so that you transfer will be easier. And we've tried to look at that, for example, with inhibitory control. So inhibitory control, which might be, for example, important for children to stop themselves from eating a marshmallow if they're told that they might have two if they wait, has been found to be important for counterintuitive reasoning. So thinking about science and maths misconceptions, or, for example, more simply, turn taking for younger children. And the idea here is to try to train children and to stop and think about what they're doing and not immediately carry out a particular task or give an answer immediately. And so that they can trying to train them to use their inhibitory control in the particular context. So we've been doing this in the Stop and Think study as part of the Unlock project, where children were, as a whole class, were going through misconceptions and encouraged to stop and think about their answer in maths and science before, instead of kind of giving the more intuitive answer that was incorrect. And we did find some benefit in maths and science in standardized tests, and this was in primary school children. An interesting review that has been published in 2018 was a meta-analysis. So that means trying to combine lots of different previous studies together. Was trying to look at whole class kind of intervention for self-regulation, trying to improve self-regulation. And they had a range, they looked at a range of different interventions. Some were curriculum-based interventions that was mainly involving younger children. Involved things like circle time games, storytelling, self-talk, role play, cognitive modeling. In adolescents, mostly they had studies looking at yoga and mindfulness. And you might be interested in the Myriad project, which has been funded in the UK, a very large project which will involve a randomized control trial looking at whether mindfulness can have beneficial effect on mental health in adolescents. There were interventions focusing on social and personal skills, which involve small group works, focusing on personal responsibility, model behavior, conflict resolution, and exercise-based interventions that involve, for example, high-intensity interval training, martial arts, team games, and finally, groups of family-based interventions that involve sometimes siblings, group meetings, and skill building of parents and children, and mentoring. And what they found in this study is that this whole range of interventions showed beneficial effects. You can see that there were not that many. So most of them, it's only maybe a handful of studies that have been carried out. Some of them are weak in terms of the control group that was used, whether children were actually involved in an active control program. But overall, there's a whole range of interventions that have been used and seem to have promising results in terms of trying to improve adolescents' self-regulation and executive function, cognitive control. And you can see that some of them are more directly kind of related to school, and some of them maybe a bit less so, for example, the family-based ones. But a lot of them could be potentially integrated within the school curriculum and the school approaches. The Center on the Developing Child from Harvard University has got this kind of very interesting booklet trying to talk about how you can enhance and practice executive function skills with children from infancy to adolescence. And what they say is that as children develop executive function and self-regulation skills, they need to practice reflecting on their experiences, talking about what they are doing and why, monitoring their actions, and considering possible next steps and evaluating the effectiveness of their decisions. And what they suggest is that teachers and parents have the role in scaffolding executive function skills. First, by helping children complete challenging tasks, and then by gradually stepping back to let children manage the process independently and learn from their mistakes. The problem is that it's not easy to find exactly how you step back and at what level, and think about exactly the right level that what children can achieve and try and get better at without getting them discouraged. But it's kind of importantly trying to scaffold these skills. They suggest a whole sorts of activities that what can be done to improve executive function for adolescents. I don't have time to go into all of them in detail, but some of them involve goal setting, planning, and monitoring. So, for example, helping teens develop plans for the goals they've identified, trying to give tools for self-monitoring. For example, help adolescents be mindful of interruptions, encourage self-talk, writing a personal journal to foster self-reflections. And then there are a series of activities. Some of them I've mentioned before in this meta-analysis, which involve yoga or sports or strategy games, and also study skills for thinking, for example, being aware of critical times for focused attention, using memory supports for organizing tasks. I said, adolescents are still improving in their multitasking, their prospective memory abilities, and even adults benefit from using memory props, whether it's their phone or calendar or diaries, to organize themselves. So to summarize this section of cognitive control and executive functions continue to improve during adolescence. Executive functions are important for academic achievement, and training interventions based on repetitive practice or strategy use are being developed with varying transfer to academic outcome. And the key findings that executive functions can be scaffolded within an educational context and through this kind of range of interventions, although more research needs to be done to try really think about which one might be most beneficial and which combination maybe of interventions might be best. So the last section I want to talk about, social emotional cognition. So social cognition is how we process, store, and use information about other people and how this in turn influences our behavior, feelings, and social interactions. And I quite like showing this cartoon about what journalists think about the anatomy of a teenager's brain. And you can see a lot of the section like the birds and the bees lobe, the cool gauge, center of the universe center, supraturbo rebellion center, self-image, fitting in gland, are to do with themselves and others and the interactions with others, so some aspects of social cognition. So there's the finding of now a number of decades of research is about the importance of the social context in adolescence. So you can read, if you're interested, a review by Blakemore and Mills looking at the adolescence, suggesting that adolescence is a sensitive period for social cultural processing. In my own work, I found that there's, for example, increase in perspective taking during adolescence. So when you ask participants to keep in mind the fact that other individuals might have a different view from them, and when you're trying to follow the instructions, you find that adolescents tend to have more of a self-focus of this, their own knowledge, and forget to take into account someone else's perspective. During adolescence, there's also hypersensitivity to social exclusion. This has been looked at with this cyberball task, where participants are first included in a ball game and then they're not included anymore. The other two players are not sending the ball to them. And we ask them questionnaires. You find that adolescents, when they've been excluded from this just a very simple online ball game, their mood drops more and the anxiety increases more than adults. And what you hear quite a lot in the news in general is about the peer influence on risk-taking. And this has been studied in the lab, for example, by Larry Steinberg, in a sort of very simple game where adolescents had to go as fast as they could around a circuit. And risk-taking can be measured as a proxy by the number of crashes they end up in. And they had adolescent, young adults, and adults, male participants carrying out this game. And when they were doing the game alone, they ended up in the same number of crashes. They're suggesting that adolescents can actually evaluate risk or take this kind of decision very similarly to adults. But they had another conditions where they had two friends sitting behind them. And this is what happens. So when they had two friends watching them, adolescents end up with more than double the number of crashes than they had when they were alone, while adults doesn't matter. And so this relates to real life epidemiological results where adolescents, young adults tend to end up in much more car accidents than adults do. So in the presence, in a social context, the adolescent's decision-making is different. In another study carried out in a kind of large group of participants in a science museum, participants were asked to rate the riskiness of everyday situations. And then they were given information about what other adolescents and adults, how they would judge the riskiness of the situation. And then they were asked to give the answer again. And so you can study how much they were influenced by what other adolescents or other adults were thinking. And what they found was that children and adults, they found that they were more influenced by what other adults were thinking, while young adolescents were mostly influenced by what other teenagers, other adolescents were thinking, while the mid-adolescents were sort of in middle. So adolescents are specifically influenced by what other adolescents are thinking. Finally, you might think that all of this is maybe a sort of a human effect, human findings, and in fact, the results suggest some studies carried out on animals suggest that other animals also show this particular influence of the social context in adolescence. So this is a study done in juvenile rats. So juvenile rats are the sort of equivalent age of adolescence in adults, in humans, sorry. And what they found was that when you put rats with their litter mates, so that's other rats they've grown up with in their cage, and you give them access to alcohol, what they found was that when they were by themselves, adolescents drank less than when they were in the company of their litter mates, while adult rats, you didn't see the difference. So this means that rats drink more or show different patterns of behavior when they're in a social context, but adults don't. Showing that the effect we're finding in adolescence in humans are partly driven by much broader biologically driven changes in the brain. And so kind of focused on this kind of more social context, and that's also related to how the adolescent brain is processing emotional and reward related information. And there's some evidence of greater emotional reactivity in adolescents. So for example, if you show adolescents emotional faces, so faces showing fear, for example, and you ask when they're in this fMRI scanner, and you measure activity in the amygdala, so a subcortical region deep in the brain that seems to be particularly activated when you're seeing very salient stimuli, including angry faces or dangerous stimuli or fearful faces. What you find is that adolescents here show greater activity in the amygdala than children and adults, suggesting this kind of their brain is reacting more to these emotional stimuli. And adolescents are also more sensitive to rewards in a social context. So for example, this is in nucleus accumbens, another part of this kind of deep region, subcortical region. And what they found, there was a task where you could get a reward, and that these brain regions showed greater activity when the adolescents were receiving this reward while in the presence of their peers, while again, adults didn't show this difference. So a reward is more rewarding when you're being watched by your peers. Going back to this very large cross-cultural study by Larry Steinberg, they tried to kind of collect some tasks looking at this processing of reward and maybe risk. And they called it this sensation-seeking composite measures combining performance on this car driving game, a card game where you have to try and find packs of cards that have most rewards, and some of them have immediate large rewards, and some of them are actually better packs to use to pick from if you want to have like more rewards over a longer period. And also a question about self-reported sensation seeking. And what they found was that sensation seeking peaks around 18, 19, so towards the late end of adolescence. So this means, if you think back about the other graph earlier, that this period of adolescence, so mid to late adolescence, you have a peak in sensation seeking, but your cognitive control is still improving. So maybe you don't have all of those self-regulation skills that might help you make the right decision in a particular context. What happens in the brain? Well, in the subcortical regions, I've shown you the amygdala one, for example, but you have a peak in activity in those brain regions that are processing emotion and reward during adolescence. So there's increased reactivity. And in the social brain networks, which are illustrated here in green, you have increased activity in the temporal regions of the brain and decreased activity over time in the medial prefrontal cortex. So showing, again, these prolonged changes in the brain networks that are supporting social cognition. I didn't show many graphs about it, but I just want to flag, again, there are like very significant individual differences in this sensation-seeking, risk-taking, influence of peer influence in adolescence, where you have some adolescents who are much more prone to take risk-taking, while other adolescents which might steer through adolescence without kind of having any kind of really misbehavior or any kind of big problems or very like big emotional tantrums. So there's a lot of individual differences. What are the implications for education? Well, this whole range that you can think of, things you can think of. There is the importance of social interactions in the classroom, which can have different roles. So for example, that might lead to distractions. It might be important for teachers to actually be aware of the social networks and social context in their own classroom. It might have influences for group work. So if you put together children or adolescents who could work or not work together, and how they together might influence each other. There's questions about how you can use rewards positively. So for example, in a very specific group of adolescents with conduct disorder, it's been found that punitions don't actually work very well, but rewards can work well to try and improve behavior. There's the importance of peer status, and of kind of the social status of different individuals, and you might have increase in loneliness, for example, during adolescence. And schools, it's been found that schools can foster positive academic values and socially supporting environments, actually promoting the social development of adolescents. You can try to use peer influence in a positive way. So for example, it's been found that academic performance and motivation improve when students spend time with academically high achieving peers. And adolescents' pro-social behavior increases when they spend time with friends with higher levels of pro-social behavior. And finally, there's some studies have tried to look at whether when you carry out an interventions, you can try to build on the social networks and try to use students who might have a bigger influence on others because of their status in the social network to have an effect, a bigger effect. So in this study, which was trying to reduce conflict at school, they found that when the group of students who were involved in sort of carrying out an anti-bullying campaign or reducing conflict, when the group of students involved in that had more influencing students who had a kind of higher role in the social networks of the school, then you had a bigger effect of the intervention. Importantly, you have to be careful because some other studies found that if you're within that group, you had actually students who maybe had a negative influence, who might maybe more risk-taking, more antisocial themselves, then you might have more of that antisocial behavior. So you really have to think about the sort of role models in this context. As an example of an intervention, some work I've carried out in my own group, there was a collaboration with an arts and science collaboration, and it was a called Meta, this project. And in this project, we co-wrote we worked with a playwright to write a play about adolescents in a school, and we talked about their brain and self-regulation difficulties within the play. And this was performed in schools, theaters, in homeless hostels. And so this involved Sarah Woods and Tony McBride. And you had a range of actors, again, talking, they had the play, but within it was interspersed information about the brain. And we also had always a PhD student or myself involved in the play, and we could engage adolescents to reflect on their self-regulation skills and on what strategies they could develop to prevent conflicts in difficult situations, to try to maybe encourage this metacognition, so thinking about their own self-regulation and thinking about how their own brain is developing and what they could do. So to summarize this section, adolescence is a period of profound socio-emotional changes. The social brain continues to mature during adolescence, and subcortical regions sensitive to hormonal changes show increased reactivity to emotional and social rewarding stimuli. Adolescents are particularly sensitive to their peers and the social context which influence their behavior. And interventions can try to capitalize on social networks carefully, because again, you have to think about which individuals you're actually using for these interventions, and support adolescents in developing self-regulation skills. To summarize a little bit what's going on during adolescent brain development, I like to refer to this paper by Dumontheil. We're trying to synthesize everything I've talked about today. So on one side, during development, you have pubertal changes in the limbic system. So these regions that are involved in sensation seeking, novelty seeking, and motivational salience of peer context, all of these are kind of increased during adolescence. On the other side, you have a gradual development of the cognitive control system and the social brain. that allow more flexible frontal cortical engagement depending on the context. And that means that adolescents might actually be better at shifting and thinking about different goals depending on their context. But during development, you have this interaction between these developing frontal system and the increased influence of sort of social affective influences on goal and behavior. And the idea is that over time, you might have positive growth trajectories which lead to adaptive exploration and mature long-term goals and social competence, or negative growth trajectories which lead to diminished goals and depression, social withdrawal, or excessive motivation towards negative goals like substance use and excessive risk-taking might come from that. So that's something I haven't talked much about today because there's only limited time, but adolescence is also the time where you have a significant increase in socio-emotional mental health problems in particular. And so a big question in our field is what can you do to maybe delay or improve or avoid this type of mental health problems. So finally, I've already talked in different bits about education. I just want to summarize some of it. So of course, to start with, you need a healthy body and a healthy brain. So physical activities, nutrition, information about nutrition, reducing stress, good sleep, all of these will be important for good cognitive and brain function. I've talked about cognitive control, and there might be specific cognitive training, maybe within maths, or kind of general working memory training that might have beneficial effects. Also focusing on metacognition and strategy use, so trying to use your executive skills in a particular context. There's important of the social affective context, which might have impact when you think about how peers are interacting, role models, how you can use collaboration, competition, or rewards within the school. And I've talked about self-regulation and how that might potentially be fostered or scaffolded through training strategies, or thinking about metacognition, or other interventions which are focused on relaxation and mindfulness, which may enhance adolescents' ability to control their emotions or reflect on their emotions and their attention. So to sum up, adolescence is a time of hormonal changes, of changes in brain structure and brain function, and of cognitive changes, in particular in the domains of emotional and reward processing, social cognition, and executive functions. Adolescents are particularly sensitive to the socio-affective and motivational context, which has an impact on their decision-taking. And these factors together influence adolescents' behavior, mental health, and learning. To end with, I just want to suggest some books that you might be interested in. There's a book by Professor Sarah Jane Blakemore about the secret life of the adolescent brain. A book by Bettina Honen, Jen Gilmore, and Tara Murphy, who are clinical psychologists, which are more giving you maybe more practical suggestions about how you can deal with teenagers, and tips for parents and teachers. And we recently published a book about educational neuroscience, which is more about the research looking at development across the lifespan and a whole range of issues and topics. The Center for Educational Neuroscience is a series of seminars, and because of COVID in the recent year and a half, they've been online and recorded, which is could be a very useful resources for you. And there's also other resources about how the brain works and neuromyths that you might be interested in. And so finally, I would like to thank you for your attention, and here are my contact details if you want to ask any questions, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.